I welcome you to the 2020 Fall Franciscan Zoom Lectures hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. The title of tonight's lecture is The Psalms as Antidote to Indifference and Discouragement. Without further ado, I present to you the president of the Franciscan School of Theology, Father Garrett Galvin.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be with you here this evening. And so I just wanted to think a little bit with you about the Psalms. And I think at times it's easy for us to kind of overlook just how important and central the Psalms are to our life. Every time we go to Mass, there's a responsorial psalm, which 99% of the time is actually going to be from the Psalms. And we turn to the Psalms at lots of different times in our faith lives. We have the Liturgy of the Hours that many religious say and many secular Franciscans practice. And then we know at times of difficulty in the life of our country, we'll really focus on something like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. So Psalms are a part of our faith life every week that we go to Mass, and for many of us every day when we pray. So let's think a little bit more about the Psalms, and let's try to focus on how they are going to help us overcome the difficulties of our life, help us in this time of pandemic, in this time of indecision. We know in a week we'll have the elections will be finished, and probably about 45% of the country is going to be, really upset. And, it doesn't matter who wins. We know a lot of people will be feeling indifferent and discouraged. And so the Psalms offer us a way through those things, a way towards community and each other. So as we think about the Psalms then, let's see what is the kind of core element. And to a certain extent, this question is something that scholars have pursued for a long time. What is the center of the Psalms? And they've proposed a number of different centers. Some people would say the idea of refuge, that we can turn to the Lord. And the very word refuge appears repeatedly in the Psalms. But most would say, no, that really isn't the center of them. Others would say the Lord is king. And that's a very important concept, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, especially in the Psalms up in the 90s. But those are still not a majority, near a majority of the Psalms. Others will say that Torah and the Jewish idea of the law as a gift, we can also translate Torah as instruction, is the center. And certainly some of the greatest Psalms are meditations on Torah. But once again, we don't see it all entirely there. And then others will say covenant, the Jewish idea of berith is the center. And so what we kind of see is that all these ideas are very important for understanding the Psalms, but there's no kind of one size fits all. There's groups of Psalms that all these are applicable to, but there's much larger groups that they are inapplicable to. And so rather than kind of seeing one of these concepts as the center of the Psalms, I think it's better to think about the Psalms as reflecting our lived experience, reflecting the God of the living, the God of community. There we can see how important Psalms are for us. So as we look throughout, I would say really the entire Bible, and certainly throughout the Old Testament, there's really no place, there's no book that focuses us so much on our bodies, whether that be our heart, whether that be our breath, whether that be our eyes, all different parts of our bodies. And that's how we live. We live through our bodies, and our lived experience is mediated through them. And so a central understanding of the Psalms, and this is something that recent scholarship has been focusing on, is this idea of embodiment, that the Psalms reflect embodiment. And so that's important for us. we can think of embodiment in a number of different ways. We can think of the kind of the Christian concept of the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh. We can also think of this as forcing us to be relational. And that's a very important concept, very important idea for us, and that we relate to one another through our bodies. And then it forces us to be communal. When I lived in Guatemala, I lived at a parish called Dios con nosotros, God is with us. And I think the Psalms are really trying to give us that sense of God is with us, that this is our kind of lived experience. And we have to align ourselves with that and be in tune with it. So it's been important, I would say, kind of in the last 20 or 30 years, to see that scholars have found much more organization within the Psalms than was previously thought about. A number of scholars have always kind of looked at this, but I think great strides have been made to understand the book of Psalms a little bit like how we understand the Torah. So sometimes we'll call the Torah the 5 books of Moses. And we can think of the Psalms as the 5 books of David. And so we clearly see what we call doxologies, or studies of praise that mark the ends of these books in 41, 72, 89, 106, and 150. And then when we go through these, we see a clear movement. And so really those first 3 books will be focused on lament. And so lament's another word for kind of disorientation or cries of pain. We know, sometimes we'll lament when bad things happen to us or when we're having a bad day. And I think this is very important. And we see St. Francis very attracted to these Psalms of lament. And there's a certain kind of paradox here, because when we think of St. Francis, we think of him as a very joyful person and his kind of infectious joy. But really, I think to be a joyful person means that we can't suppress our emotions. And so lament is just kind of the other side of that coin, that's an acknowledgement of the pain in our lives, of the difficulties that we face. And we see many people at times suppress those emotions. They'll have difficulties in their life and they won't tell anyone about them. Difficult things will happen and no one knows what's going on. And to a certain extent, they don't even know what's going on. They just kind of try to pretend it didn't happen and move forward. That's not a biblical spirituality. That's not what the Psalms encourage us to do. They encourage us to be honest about our problems, to cry out to God about our problems. And that's how we can kind of work through our problems, by being honest about them and realizing, the tools God has given us to kind of deal with those problems. So the first 90 Psalms, many of them are really focused on lament and difficulty. So as I said, the first book, very strong focus on lament. In the second book, we see that as well. And then in the third book, we have a movement really towards acknowledging the fall of Jerusalem, which is the great disaster of the Old Testament. The Jerusalem temple is destroyed. But from that nadir, from that low point, we start kind of building up again. And this is very important, that we kind of see that at the most difficult point in Israel's life, God emerges in a new way for them. And so we see that in books 4 and 5, a new presence of God, and a change from lamenting to acknowledging the greatness of God. And then in the final book, really thinking about wisdom. And there's a great focus on wisdom, being able to discern God's presence in the world. So we have then kind of a strong movement that is going to be important for us to acknowledge and see, that at difficult, there's a lot of difficulty represented in the first 3 books of the Psalms, but then we move from that difficulty and really from the darkest hour back towards confidence in God, that God is helping us at those difficult hours, that God is really trying to redeem or, kind of buy back, you know, um, goodness in our lives. So that's, I think, something in our spiritual lives that we also should be looking for, that when we're going through great difficulties, that we have that confidence that this isn't the end. This is part of the journey. And so we can think of the Psalms very much in those terms. And Psalms 1 and 2 will start in a very positive way, walking with God, having God in our lives. And we'll go to some very difficult laments through the first 3 books, but then we'll reemerge, and ultimately we end with praise and a sense of renewal. And so we have that sense that God wants and desires renewal for us. As we try to kind of overcome indifference and discouragement, we really have to kind of know where to look to do that, to kind of have a strong sense of that. And so we do have those songs of lament that help us not suppress emotion, help us kind of deal honestly with things. But at times we don't want to be overly focused there. And if we want to kind of overcome indifference and discouragement, a lot of times I think it's going to be important to focus on the majesty of God, to focus on the strength and goodness of God. And so that's why I think it's so important to kind of have an awareness of books 4 and 5, where we're going to see many more Psalms thinking about God's goodness. And so let's think a little bit more about book 4, take a kind of little bit of a deeper dive there. So there's going to be 3 Psalms that, really focus on, God is king, or we could say the Lord reigns. And so this is giving us a sense of kind of order in the world. And that in spite of appearances, and so if we think about Psalm 89, we've got this appearance of Jerusalem in ashes, of destruction and difficulties. Despite those appearances, God still reigns. God still is king. And the Psalms are going to push us to see that repeatedly. And even in those first 3 books, we'll think about a number of Psalms that help us understand how God reigns, how God is present in our lives in the midst of sometimes disaster. And what's, I think, very important for us is that a number of these Psalms, especially Psalms 96 and 98, will encourage us to sing a new song. And so that concept of newness is a very important concept, both in the Old and the New Testament. We have a sense, a lot of times, even when the prophets are speaking to us in their oracles, and they'll have symbolic gestures where they'll have a new cloak, or where they'll perform an action with a new axe, for example, if you're the prophet Elisha. And so what I think these Psalms are trying to do after the real low point in Psalm 89 is kind of encourage us or move us towards a sense of renewal, that after we go through difficult experiences, we have to kind of consider those. And I think we have to make those experiences kind of part of our spiritual journey, but we also then have to have a new song that we can sing. And so when we have these difficult experiences, I believe a biblical spirituality tries to integrate those into our lives and kind of help us to move forward. And so Psalm 104 is going to be a great example of that. And this is one of a number of Psalms that focuses us on creation. So creation is an important theme in the book of Psalms. And creation is going to be kind of tied with wisdom literature. Creation is going to be tied with God's goodness. And we have a strong sense that what God creates is good. It reflects God's desires for us. And so in that psalm, we have these all-important verses. Verse 30, when you send forth your breath, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. So there's this constant opportunity for renewal. And ultimately, what these Psalms are doing is that they are allowing us to make sense of our lives, to make meaning of our world, to bring coherence to often chaotic circumstances. And then we see this in God's actions. We'll see kind of chaos at the beginning of creation in the first chapter of Genesis. But then we see God instilling order and goodness on that chaos. And I think the Psalms encourage us to think about our lives in a similar way, that we all meet chaos within our lives. We all get disoriented by difficulties. And ultimately, we are able to kind of move beyond those things with this biblical order and see the order that God brings to chaos, and that we have new life, we have renewal in our lives. And so this, I think, is the great challenge that Book 4 is rising to, that the people of God, Israel, have faced all kinds of chaos, and many of the leaders have been forced into exile in Babylon, and they are kind of finding God's order even in Babylon, even far from the traditions and customs that they're aware of, that God reigns throughout the world. And so that's going to be very important for us. I think an important psalm that kind of echoes that is Psalm 82. And so Psalm 82 is a short psalm, just 5 or 6 verses, but the idea of God's justice arises again and again. And it's a very universal psalm that kind of acknowledges the belief in many other gods, but that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is in charge of the entire universe and overcomes the disorder and at times evil that people associate with other gods. So there's this very strong sense that, God is king, the Lord reigns. And Psalm 82, a lot of people would say, really ushers the way in towards an understanding of a universal Messiah like Christ. So another key psalm, and there'll be lots of different opinions on what are the key psalms and what might be the most important psalm, but certainly to me one of the most beautiful psalms, and it's a simple psalm, is this Psalm 100. But I think what Psalm 100 tells us about God is as profound, really, as anything we're going to find in the Bible. And to proclaim this psalm is, I think, in many respects, to proclaim a creed. And so as we think about it, what are we saying we believe in? And so we hear, shout joyfully to the Lord, all you lands. Worship the Lord with cries of gladness. Come before him with joyful song. Know that the Lord is God, our maker to whom we belong, whose people we are, God's well-tended flock. Enter the temple gates with praise, its courts with thanksgiving. Give thanks to God, bless his name. Good indeed is the Lord, whose love endures forever, whose faithfulness lasts through every age. So to me, that's really kind of a vital set of beliefs that we have about God. And I think very important, and we'll kind of come back to this, because we'll hear people tell us many different things about God. And I think this psalm is something that we can ascend to and with great integrity. And I think we're called to really understand God in this way. And so as we think of the key concepts, we see God as our creator or maker, to whom we belong. So we are part of God, and we are God's family. I think that's very important, that our identity is through God, and that God has a certain order for us, that God desires to tend this flock, to tend us, to take care of us in a very important way, that we're well tended. We're encouraged towards gratitude, enter the temples with praise, thanksgiving, give thanks. So we get that again and again. giving thanks. If we look at our world through gratitude, I think we'll be able to make order of it. We'll be lifted up when we keep on thinking about God's gifts rather than what we're entitled to. And then finally, who God is. Good is the Lord. This idea of tov is the Hebrew word that we've heard. We heard it 7 times in the first chapter of Genesis, really reflecting God's goodness. And then we have this sense, of God's love that's always with us. The Hebrew word here is chesed, which is a very important sense of God being in solidarity with us. This is a love that motivates, that acts. And then finally, and perhaps just as importantly, this sense of trust that we can have God. God's faithfulness lasts for every age. So I think this is a very important creed, really, that we find in the Old Testament. And I think something easy for us to agree with and to proclaim. Once again, we've kind of seen that there's a lot of Psalms of lament. There's a movement initially within the book of Psalms, in the first 89 of them, towards the fall of Jerusalem, towards great difficulties. But that isn't a death. It's an end of the temple in Jerusalem. It's an end of the order that people recognized in Jerusalem, but it's a new beginning. And the prophet Jeremiah tells us very clearly in the 29th chapter of his book, go and start new gardens in Babylon, start new families. And we see Israel doing this throughout Mesopotamia. We see Israel going to Egypt and doing this. And we see Israel doing this even within the Holy Land as new endeavors happen and ultimately a second temple is constructed. And so the focus here again is on a new song or a new beginning, whatever way we want to kind of understand that. And so we have that sense of creation that we looked at in Psalm 104 as reflecting God's order, reflecting God's goodness, that God, brings life to the world, renews life in every season. Here in California, we're kind of waiting for our rains now. We know they're a little bit late, and with those rains will come renewal. Now, book 5, as I think I briefly mentioned before, I think really focuses us on wisdom. And we could look at a psalm like 139 that God understands us so much better than we understand ourselves. And we have to kind of let God guide us and let God love us and be aware of that kind of great love. We'll see a great focus on the Torah as well here. And so as we think about this wisdom, the Torah would be, I think, Psalm 119. As we think about this wisdom, we'll see, while the poor were released from their affliction, their families increased like their flocks. The upright saw this and rejoice. All wickedness shut its mouth. Whoever is wise will take note of these things, will ponder the merciful deeds of the Lord. So the wise are looking for God in this world, and they are finding God. They are seeing God's goodness. And the wicked are quiet when they hear God being praised, when they see gratitude. So we have that call to wisdom very strongly at the end, in these Psalms, at the end of the book of Psalms. And as I've mentioned, the Psalms end with many Psalms of praise. And so this then, I think, gives us an important kind of sense of wisdom. And that part of wisdom is, knowing that who we belong to, knowing that there's something greater than us and that needs to be praised, that will bring order to our world, that will give us, I think, grateful hearts. And the more we are able to kind of decenter ourselves and put God in the center. So as we talked about, is there a center to the Psalms? It's that kind of living God, that lived experience. I think that's at the center. And so we have language that at times can strike people as a little unusual in the modern world. We're coming up to Halloween, so when you say fear, we think of ghosts and goblins and strange kinds of things. But when we talk about fear in the Bible, what we're really talking about is our faith life. That when we have fear of the Lord, that simply means that we know that God has to be at the center. And if we have no fear of the Lord, we put ourselves at the center. We think there's nothing more important than ourselves. But when we have fear of God, we know that we can put God at the center. So we hear, you satisfy the desire of those who fear you. You hear their cry and save them. You, Lord, watch over all who love you, but all the wicked you destroy. My mouth will speak your praises, Lord. All flesh will bless your holy name forever. So we have this vocabulary of, blessing, of praise, and constantly kind of returning to that, praise and blessing that puts God at the center. So from there, I think we have a challenge. In our faith life, we can kind of think of our faith kind of like our cross. There's a vertical part to the cross and there's a horizontal part to the cross. And you can't have a cross without a vertical and horizontal, aspect to them. And I would argue the same is the case with our faith life. And the Psalms really help us with that. Now, the vertical dimension of the Psalms, I think everyone recognizes, and I think as Catholics and Christians, and I think even as Jews and Muslims, people are really good at acknowledging the greatness of God and worshiping God, and really kind of having a sense of God's majesty. And we'll see, there's lots of concepts that give us that in the Psalms. God is king, and this idea of refuge, and we'll see kind of lots of language. But the important kind of aspect of this as well is that we can't control God. And so sometimes when we get too focused on the vertical God, we can fall into kind of mechanistic prayers where we think if we say these prayers or do this novena or kind of read this special Bible verse, we'll be able to get God to do what we want God to do. And that's certainly not the case. We are always going to suffer, and we're always going to have difficulties in our life, no matter how well we follow God. And so we get that strong sense, though, of this, majestic God that we look to the heavens at times towards when we say, Lord, my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock of refuge, my shield, my saving horn, my stronghold. Most of these are kind of, things that aren't necessarily alive. A rock, a fortress, a shield, a sword, a saving horn. These are kind of abstract ideas, or they could be concrete things, but they're not living things. And we turn to the horizontal to think about the living. And this is going to be, I think, a much greater challenge for us to how do we see, God in the horizontal. And when I say the horizontal, those things that we can look at, that we can see eye to eye with, or that are kind of part of our experience here in the world. So we're going to think a lot more about that. And I think that's very important at a number of levels. And I'll just tell kind of a short little story. My dad was recently visiting me, reminded me that when I think I was in 4th grade, and I think my brother was in kindergarten, we'd gone to the store one day, and I always loved to kind of run and bring back the basket, the cart. And, we're kind of a busy family, everyone's running around. And I took off and brought the cart back, and no one was paying too much attention. And I can remember this vividly. I come out of the store, and Mom and Dad and my brother, they're all gone. The car's gone. I kind of walked back there, and then I thought, well, are they going around? Well, as a child, it seemed like a long time. I think it was just a few minutes, but they actually drove, I think, about halfway home. And then finally, my brother said, where's Garrett? And my parents thought I was joking. I was like hiding behind the seat in the car. This is before we used to wear seat belts and all that good stuff, And so finally they determined I wasn't there, and luckily, now I know why God gave me a little brother, so they turned around and they picked me up, and, they were, kind of a little distraught about the whole thing. But that was, kind of the lived experience, why we need each other, and that very horizontal experience. And so I think we have to think about kind of let's say, this kind of what I like to call, and others call, kind of pro-social behavior, kind of how we engage with each other. And just like we've got 5 books of David, I think we can think about 5 pro-social behaviors, sharing, cooperating, donating, helping, and volunteering. These are all things that we do with each other. And these are all kind of horizontal expressions, I think, of God's goodness in our life. And so as we think about the first kind of aspect of the horizontal, this is this sense of God's faithfulness. And at first it was kind of with King Saul, that didn't last too long, but then King David was very strong. And the kings ultimately, when we in the Bible, represent this great relationship with God. And King David will see exalted in many of the Psalms, or references to David in the Psalms, and just gets at kind of the God of relationship. And so this language of fidelity, of trust, of faithfulness is very important. That's what relationships are based on. And we all know there's people that we don't trust, and we can't have a good relationship with them. And so when we find people that we can trust, that we have good relationships, we have a sense of God in our life. And God is mediated through these people. And so we'll hear in a psalm like Psalm 45, your arrows are sharp. Peoples will cower at your feet. The king's enemies will lose heart. Your throne, O God, stands forever. Your royal scepter is a scepter for justice. And so once again, we see that embodiment, the feet, the heart, and this sense of the king defending us. And so relationship, very important. Where I think we're called to think, who is our king? Who is our queen? Who defends us? Who's been there for us? Very, very important for us to kind of have that sense. A second aspect of the horizontal is going to be Zion. Now, Zion's kind of a complicated word. We hear it probably a lot. It's another word for Jerusalem, or maybe the highest part of Jerusalem, or even the temple. And this is a concrete thing, a very concrete thing, not a living thing. But it's interesting that at times when we're describing the temple, it will also be like when we're describing the ark, we find that it's really just God that we're talking about. So the temple can stand for God. And that's why it was so devastating when it was destroyed, that people thought, well, as long as the temple is there, God is there, and nothing can happen. But we didn't have that promise from God. But we do have a promise from God to be in our lives. And so the temple has kind of stood for that. And many Psalms kind of glory in that. And so if we look at Psalm 122, and now our feet are standing within your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city, walled round about. Here the tribes have come, the tribes of the Lord, as it was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Here are the thrones of justice, the thrones of the house of David. So we get a great aspect here of, seeing God in the places of our life. Once again, kind of horizontal. And so if we were to think about that first gift that we thought about in terms of relationship, we're kind of very much sharing there. When we're in relationship, we're sharing feelings with people, we're sharing concerns, we're sharing tasks and burdens, very kind of pro-social behavior. And this is a place where we can gather. And so when we come together, we're engaged in social behavior as well. A third aspect of the Psalms, and once again, very important, is this sense of the people of God, and that we are able to kind of experience God through God's people. And so I think if we think about pro-social behavior again, there's helping, that we help each other, that as the people of God, we're bound together, and once again kind of sharing relationships and doing things together looking out for each other. And so this is where the righteous, the just ones are kind of really elevated. And we'll see kind of, I referred to this in Psalm 82 already, the importance of justice and those people who help kind of bring justice into our world. So in Psalm 32, we'll hear, "Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you just. Exult, all you upright of heart." So both, the just and the upright, the same kind of semantic field, the same meaning of both those words. That's where we find God, with people who are thirsting for justice. We hear this throughout the Bible, in the Old and the New Testament. For justice will return to the righteous. And when we hear righteous, we always have to be careful, because we can think about it a little bit as kind of self-righteous, but it's the exact opposite. Righteous really means to be in right relationship with God. And so for justice will return to the righteous, and all the upright in heart will follow it. So once again, God is mediated through the people that are focused on justice. So we see this in our Catholic tradition. One of our most recent saints, St. Oscar Romero, someone who just thirsted for justice for the people of El Salvador. We can think of St. Stanley Rother, another person who thirsted for justice for the people of Guatemala. And here in the United States, we can think about someone like Martin Luther King or Dorothy Day, people that thirsted for justice. They mediated God for many people who were in kind of desperate straits. And so kind of returning to Psalm 82 again, there's this sense that the other gods, and I think when we think of the other gods, we can even think of the idols and the idols that we have in our own lives, be that money, be that technology, be that unhealthy desires. These all fall, and it's justice that marks God. God fights all these things in our lives and helps us kind of overcome them. So the fourth and kind of final aspect that I'd like to kind of focus on in terms of the horizontal is, once again, this kind of idea of thanksgiving. And when we're thankful, I think really the pro-social behavior that we're thinking about, again, is cooperating. And we can be thankful that we have friends to cooperate with, friends to work on. We can be thankful that we can cooperate with God, that we can use our will, our desire to kind of seek what God wants with our lives. So Thanksgiving Psalms are very important for us. This kind of, once again, brings us to community, that we come together, whether it's at Thanksgiving, we come together as families, and oftentimes we come together at Mass at Thanksgiving, or we have Masses of Thanksgiving. And this idea of gratitude, I think gratitude is always going to force us to think, what's right in my world, and then who is helping me with that. Certainly, when I try to think about what I'm grateful for, it's almost always kind of other people, who have done some kind of kind thing for me, who've reached out, who've lightened a burden, who've made me laugh, whatever it may be. These are ways of kind of cooperating with others, of engaging community. And I think this kind of, returning to our kind of initial point as we kind of try to think of the Psalms, why they're an antidote to indifference and discouragement, is that they push us to community. They push us to communities that will support us, but also that will allow us to support others. And I think that's, that give and take is so important, that if it's all about me all the time and how everyone can support me, well then, I get a fat head, and I become the center. And we have already said we have to kind of put God at the center. But when God's at the center, we see God giving us, many gifts. And these gifts allow us to work together. These gifts allow us to see each other made in the image and likeness of God. These gifts allow us to have vibrant communities. So we can hear this in Psalm 30. I praise you, Lord, for you raised me up and did not let my enemies rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me. Lord, you brought me up from Sheol. You kept me from going down to the pit. Sing praise to the Lord, you faithful. Give thanks to God's holy name. And so we see this key here in the Psalm of, thanks, that God, and this is kind of the whole story of the Psalms, that in Psalm 89, we kind of hit that low point. God picked up Israel and God reoriented them. And so these Psalms keep on kind of giving us language to do that we have difficulties, we have low points. Sheol is just the Hebrew for, a place of meaninglessness, that the afterlife without any reward, and that we are brought back from that into community and into meaning, and that we have to focus on gratitude in order to have a new song, to be able to see God's redemption in our world. So I think that's the end of the little talk, kind of trying to think about how we kind of overcome indifference and discouragement through the Psalms.
Well, I thank you, Father Garrett, for your lecture, which helped uncovers the beauty of the vibrant Franciscan tradition. This opportunity is brought to you by the Franciscan School of Theology, Department of Development. Let us give Father Garrett a collective applause.